Hello and welcome to the Varsity Tutors Distinguished Speaker Series for parents of students with learning differences. Tonight, we're honored to welcome Dr. Russell Barkley, a world-renowned authority on attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or as we all know it, ADHD. He's the author of 12 Principles for Raising a Child with ADHD, and tonight he's going to take us through several of those principles so that we can all help all of our learners thrive. Now, before I turn it over to Dr. Barkley to get us started, just have a few announcements for the group out here. One, we want to make this as helpful and beneficial to you personally as possible. So you'll see there's a chat box to the right of the screen. We invite you to use that box to type in questions whenever you have them. In the last 10 to 15 minutes or so of our tonight's session, I'll interview Dr. Barkley with your questions to get as many answers as possible. We'll also ask the more broadly applicable the questions, the more likely we are to be able to ask those. So we'll use the time as wisely as possible. And so, keep that in mind when submitting your questions there, and we'll try to get as many answers, like I said, as possible. Next up, we know there are thousands of you out there right now, but there are tens of thousands of folks in our networks who can benefit from this. And so we're running a little bit of a social media contest here tonight. If you can post something you learned to Twitter tonight, tag Varsity Tutors. We'll have all the instructions up on a slide at the end of class. You'll be entered to win a prize package that includes a signed copy of Dr. Barkley's book, 12 Principles for Raising a Child with ADHD, and 5 free hours of one-on-one tutoring for Varsity Tutors for your students. So note taking is not required, but if you do have that opportunity to write down a handful of things that you found really beneficial, you'll be rewarded for sharing those to social media. And then the last thing with all that said, I'd be remiss without mentioning that this is part of an ongoing commitment we have at Varsity Tutors to serving families with learners with learning differences. And so we invite you to check out the different classes and bespoke tutoring offerings and things that we offer for anyone who has a diagnosis or just different learning needs that we can help out with. All right, with all of that said, let me turn it over to our speaker for tonight, Dr. Barkley. Dr. Barkley, I'll hand it to you.
Thank you so much, Brian. I really appreciate it. And if you all just give me a moment to bring up my screen share, I will be able to show my slides to you. And in the meantime, let me just introduce myself. I'm Russ Barkley. I'm a clinical professor of psychiatry here at the Virginia Commonwealth University School of Medicine in lovely Richmond, Virginia. And Brian was very kind to mention that this evening's lecture is based upon my latest book, 12 Principles for Raising a Child with ADHD. And we have a lot to cover this evening, so let's go ahead and get started. The first principle of the 6 I want to cover this evening is among the most important, and that is to be sure that you understand what ADHD really is. I know that ADHD is out there a lot. It's almost ubiquitous. Not a day goes by that articles don't appear in the trade media, but they're based really on the DSM-5, our diagnostic manual, and how that presents the disorder. And it presents it, as you see on this slide, as ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disability. And neurodevelopmental simply means that there is a substantial body of evidence showing that there is a biological, specifically a neurological and genetic basis to the disorder, that most cases arise from that, but it is not simply a condition that arises from social factors such as bad parenting or excess screen time. Now, when you look at our diagnostic manual, or you pick up anybody else's book about ADHD, this is the view they're going to tell you, that there's a disorder, a developmental lag in a child's ability to pay attention, hence the inattention or the A in ADHD. And also, most, though not all children, will have difficulties with hyperactivity and to even greater extent with impulsive behavior. So those are sort of the 3 domains that people largely report about. And they're not wrong. It's just that those are the most superficial features of the disorder. Now, these symptoms that we see, these behaviors, they arise early in childhood in most cases, though not always. Some cases can arise up to age 12, others even later than that. They're all legitimate cases of ADHD. They're often simply milder cases that are being detected later or being referred later, or they're very bright or gifted children and their high intelligence kind of protects them from the initial onset of impairing symptoms. So even though they have some of these behaviors, it's not as harmful to them or as impairing as it might be in children of lesser intelligence, but largely an onset in childhood or adolescence. The symptoms or behaviors have to be very persistent over time. That is, that they have to extend across time by at least 6 months, and certainly usually last far, far longer than that. We're also looking for symptoms that are pervasive. That is, they occur in more than one situation. So we're looking at symptoms that occur at home, out in the community, with peers, at schools, and so on. So we have to be seeing these problems occurring in at least two or more of those kinds of major situations. The most important thing in our diagnostic manual that distinguishes ADHD as a disorder from simply ADHD-like symptoms in high energy children is impairment. The symptoms occur to such a degree, to such frequency, that they are leading to harm, that negative consequences are occurring to the child or teen, and what I call the environment is kicking back against these excess behaviors and other symptoms. So if you want to know where does high energy or sparkling personality or talkativeness leave off, and ADHD, the disorder, begins, it's when harm occurs. Harm is usually ineffective functioning or impairment in one or more major life activities. And of course, we like to rule out other disorders that also have inattention, such as autism spectrum disorder, intellectual disability, major depression, bipolar disorder, and so on. They all have inattention as part of what is going on in the disorder. And so that leads to what I want to focus on now for a few minutes, and that is what's going on inside the mind, under the hood of this car, that is creating these obvious symptoms of hyperactive, inattentive, and impulsive behavior. Because what ADHD really is not an attention disorder, it's a self regulation disorder. And self regulation allows us to think ahead, anticipate consequences, and adjust our behavior so those things don't happen. And as this lovely cartoon by Cypress shows here, despite the humor, it actually raises a very serious question. How is it that people can, in fact, know about future consequences before they have happened? So this teenager raises a very good question. How am I supposed to think about consequences when they haven't occurred yet? Indeed, how do we do that? We do that through self-regulation and through the 7 executive functions in the brain that allow us to regulate our own behavior. So very quickly, what is self-regulation? It's any action we direct back at ourselves. What are we trying to do? Change our behavior from what it might have been. Why do we want to do that? To change a future consequence, to make an event more or less likely to occur. I'll give you a classic example. This morning, as I was sitting in bed having coffee, I took a sheet of paper and I wrote out a list of the things I had hoped to do today. So what did I do? I wrote myself a note. Why did I do that? To make a do list so that I'm more likely to do the things on the list. I'm trying to change my behavior, make it more likely to get things done. And why do I want to do that? Because if I get all those things done, my life is going to be better. My quality of life is better. I'll be more productive. I'll even be happier as a result of doing most of those things. But those are things that I need to get done to keep my life in balance. So that's what self-control is all about, managing our behavior to manage our future as well as we can. But how do we do that? No other species is able to do this except humans to the degree that we are able to do it. We're able to do this because largely coming from the frontal lobe of our brain, the executive brain, we get 7 different mental abilities. I call them mind tools that allow us to manage our behavior. Each of them is something we're doing to ourselves, an action to ourselves. So each of them is a kind of self-control. Put all 7 together, and by the time they're fully developed, usually by our 30s, we have a Swiss Army knife of mind tools that we are able to use to self-regulate, and we can use them in combination. But let me just unpack them very quickly here. These 7 executive functions, each being an action to the self, are as follows. First, We learn to attend to ourselves. That develops very early during the preschool years. We become self-aware. How do we do that? We take this attention system of the brain that we use to attend to our environment, and we start to look at ourselves. What are we doing? That's very important. If there's no self-awareness, there's of course no self-control. The second thing that comes on the heels of that, nearly at the same time, is we can restrain ourselves. We begin to develop the ability to inhibit our actions. We're not very good at it as young children. It takes about a decade or more, but by the time we're teenagers, we have most of our ability to inhibit our motor actions. So inhibition or self-restraint is the second executive function. So right away, you can see that preschoolers have a mind's mirror. They can look at themselves as if looking in a mirror, and they have the mind's brake linings. They can restrain themselves. Again, they're not very good at it. Each executive function takes 10 to 15 years, we think, to reach its full maturity, but they started. Then we get the next two, which are really kind of cool. We call them working memory. But what are they in terms of things we do to ourselves? The first one is visual imagery. We start to see to ourselves. We start to be able to hold images in mind. We can activate memories of our recent past and use them to talk to other people and also use them to guide ourselves. And I'll come back and talk about this in a moment. But visual imagery or the mind's eye is the third executive function. And right after that, within a couple of years, we get the fourth. Little children start to talk out loud to themselves, whether anyone's in the room or not. Eventually, this self-speech becomes very specific. They start to tell themselves what to do. Then it starts to get quieter, and eventually they're able to suppress their entire face and talk in their mind. Usually between 8 and 10 years of age is when children discover there's a voice in my head and it's me. I can talk to myself. So we start out by talking to others, then we talk to ourselves, then we talk in our mind, and we have our mind's voice. That gives us our fourth executive ability. Those four, which I consider to be the foundation of the executive brain, let us do the next three. We are able to control our emotions by using images and words in our mind. We can create new emotions and we can quell strong, powerful, negative emotions. You remember your mother or grandmother used to tell you when you're upset to stop, go to your happy place. So visualize something good and count to 10. Talk to yourself. Buy yourself some time to calm down. And you're using the two working memory systems to do that, images and self-speech. So that's how we're able to create emotions in ourselves, not just emotions that are provoked by the environment around us. But most importantly, we can use them to modify, moderate, and self-regulate our emotions to become more mature, more measured, less impulsive in showing our negative emotions, our frustration, our anger, even our aggression. That's very important that we're able to do that because that's the single best predictor of how many friends we're going to have in our life. You call it emotional intelligence, but it's really emotional self-regulation. Then from that, we get the sixth executive function, self-motivation, because emotions are forms of motivation. Once we can emote to ourselves, we can self-motivate. I don't need somebody rewarding me for every sentence I write in my books. And as children get older, they don't need as much external reward from others because they're able to generate it themselves. They can see the goal, they can visualize the reward they're going to get, they can talk to themselves about how great that's going to be, kind of like giving themselves a little locker room pep talk. And they can motivate themselves to stay on task, to get the work done, to accomplish that goal. So self-motivation, I think of as the mind's fuel tank. Everything else is part of the plan, what we're going to do. This is what drives the plan forward, just like the solid propellant in a cruise missile. Without the fuel, we're going nowhere. No goals get accomplished. Lastly, we develop this wonderful ability to not only hold information in mind like images and words in our head, but we can play with them. We can take them apart, recombine them. And this we call our creative, planning, and problem solving module. And it's based on children's play during their development. So there you have it. We have all 7 executive functions as mind tools. And guess what? ADHD delays all of them by about 25 to 40%, perhaps about 30% overall. So if you want to know where your child is in their executive functioning, in their self-control, they're about 30% behind on average. That's such a rough figure, but it gives you some idea that you're dealing with someone who doesn't have the self-control of a typical child of their age. The average 10-year-old with ADHD has the self-control of somebody closer to about a 7-year-old. Now, it's also helpful to understand that ADHD and the underlying executive functions that it's disrupting occurs along a dimension, a continuum. So we have typical people in the center of this bell curve here that you see. That's where most people fall in their self-control. And there are some people who are very gifted in their self-control. You see them over here on the right side of the bell curve. So a small percentage of people are extraordinary at self-regulation. These are going to be very accomplished and successful children. But over on the left side of the diagram, we have people who don't have quite as much self-control, executive functioning as others. And we refer to these people as symptomatic. They don't have the disorder, but they have some of the symptoms of ADHD, which is very low self-control. And then finally, down here, the bottom 7% or so of the population, excuse me, these slides want to advance on their own, about the bottom 7% of the population, this is where ADHD exists. And where do we draw that line to diagnose ADHD? I told you earlier, when harm occurs, when the child begins to experience impairment, adverse consequences in major life activities. And that's about the bottom 7% of the population. But let's not forget, self-control, like ADHD, falls along a dimension. We can all plot our own behavior along this dimension, and ADHD just represents the extreme tail or lower end of that dimension. So ADHD isn't a category. It's not like pregnancy. It's not something that they have and we don't, and there's some sharp demarcation between us and them. It's not true. Children with ADHD are no different from other people except in a quantitative way. It's like tall people and short people. They're not different people. They just differ along the quantitative trait of height. Some people are a little taller, some people are a little shorter. And ADHD works very much the same way. So keep that in mind because it helps us to understand that there are degrees of ADHD out there. There's marginal or symptomatic. There's mild, then moderate, then severe. So not all ADHD children are the same. So principle number 1, please understand that ADHD is a disorder of self-regulation and executive functioning. These essential mind tools that we need in order to succeed in life, see to our welfare, and become independent of our families, independent, self-governing people. And that's what's at risk when a child has ADHD. So I hope you can see that inattention is one of the least of their problems. It'll be the self-regulation problems that become the most problematic over time. Now, the second principle, which comes out of the first, is if we understand that ADHD is neurodevelopmental, that is, it's largely genetic and neurologically caused, right? Then we can begin to look at what is our role toward such a disabled child, if you wish to call them that, toward a disordered child. And the best metaphor I came up with 20 years ago or so is that of a shepherd. We have been given sheep to raise. And just like a shepherd, our job is very important. But we're not engineers. We're not architects. We don't get to design our children. We can't turn sheep into cats. They're sheep. And we can't turn ADHD children into other children that we wish them to be, because that's not what they're going to be. So it's very important to understand what is our relationship to this unique individual, this child who is a unique combination of all of our family's genes and all of the traits that go with it. And these genes have been put together in a very unique combination to create this one of a kind child that you have, who also just so happens to have ADHD as well. That's important because those genes are going to interact with your family environment in order to create eventually a unique child. So don't ever think that somehow you are the master of the universe who gets to design a child and determine exactly how they're going to turn out by the way you raise them. You don't have that kind of power or authority. Nobody does. Sorry to disappoint you if that's what you think. Children are not blank slates. You don't get to mold them into whatever you wish. They are unique combinations of abilities, aptitudes, deficits, and so on. And we got what we got. So it's very important that we accept the children we have and not keep longing for the one we didn't get, the one we thought we'd get when we were pregnant and expecting our children, but we didn't wind up getting that child. We got this one. And I'm sorry to disappoint you if that's the case, but the sooner you learn to love the one you got, to love the one you're with, to quote the Stephen Stills song from the 60s, the better off we're all going to be. Because quite honestly, I'll tell you, over my 44 years of clinical practice, a lot of the problems parents and children have with each other who are ADHD children is that parents have a set of expectations and the child can't meet them. It's impossible. They can't be the child you wished you got. They're who they are. So the sooner we accept this and get over it and understand that we are shepherds to our children, the better off we're going to be. So we don't get to design the children, but we do get to raise them. We do get to determine the pastures they grow up in, the kinds of other sheep they're going to be exposed to, the resources we're going to bring available to bear on them, and put all those together with the raw materials of our child's genetic makeup, and voila, we get a unique child. Wonderful. So if you're struggling to accept the child you have, then I encourage you to go to YouTube and Google Welcome to Holland. It's a wonderful little story about a mom who's pregnant and who says that this is the child I expected to get. She likens it to going to Venice. And she says, I read books on Italian. I got maps of Venice. I planned our tours. I knew what I was going to do. Being pregnant was very similar to that. She was getting ready for the child she hoped she would get. She gets on the plane and she lands in Holland. It's not Italy. You're in Holland. Now, what are you going to do? Are you going to complain or are you going to learn to love Holland? Well, that's what you're going to do. And it's a very nice story. It's also adapted for autism, for Down syndrome, but there's one for ADHD as well. And I love that story because it expresses very clearly this grief reaction that parents have when they realize as their child grows up, they didn't get the child they expected. They got this one instead, which is wonderful. These are great children and we can love them, but they may not be quite what you expected. So learn to be a good shepherd. Learn to provide good pastures, protection, nourishment, clothing, shelter. Accident proof your home. Monitor your child's pastures away from home. Who are they with? What resources do they have? What's out there I can take advantage of? Be alert to the fact that your child is much more likely to be bullied, victimized, and even abused by other individuals. So you have to really watch out for them and protect them from harm. And then, of course, focus on good, healthy routines and good nutrition within your family as well. So you can see that, a shepherd's job is no cakewalk. Nobody's saying just leave them a loaf of bread and go off to Las Vegas and gamble the rest of your life. What we are saying is don't think of yourself as an engineer who gets to change your child into whatever you want. You can't do that. Think of yourself as a shepherd. I just gave you the sheep. What are you going to do with it? You have a very important role here. So find the best pastures that you can, the best neighborhoods, the best schools, the highest quality, nurturing and supportive and stimulating environments, and you will have done about as much as you're going to be able to do to determine the outcome of your child. And beyond that, it's going to be out of your hands. Now, part of being a good shepherd and watching out for pastures is watching out for other bad sheep who may interact with our child. We want our children hanging around with other lambs that are good lambs and learning from them and imitating them and developing friendships with them. So we need to encourage pro-social positive behavior and encourage good peers for our children to pal around with, such as through clubs and sports and organizations and so on. We need to discourage antisocial behavior and their hanging around with deviant or bad peer groups. And if they start to do so, we need to take steps very quickly to break up those relationships because ADHD children are very gullible, very susceptible to the influences of other children, particularly other deviant children. And we don't need them being worse than they otherwise would be by hanging around with other children, especially children who may be aggressive or even heading down the road to delinquency. Try to improve the pastures if you can through increasing the amount of stimulation in the environment, the amount of accommodations that you can make, getting special services at school if you need it, getting extra tutoring such as through varsity tutors for out of school help if you need that. If your child has certain aptitudes and gifts, as I'm about to talk about, we need to look for good resources for them as well, and then set up very good recurring predictable home routines. ADHD children, more than typical children, need expectations that they can rely on in terms of their family life being predictable. Sometimes that's hard because 35% of parents of ADHD children have ADHD themselves. Whoa, talk about chaos. Now we've got two ADHD people living with each other, trying to deal with each other. So if that's the case with you, you need to get your ADHD diagnosed and managed, and then that will spill over to improve your management of your child and your ability to run a more predictable household with less chaos involved. And then, as we'll talk about later, you need to learn to manage from a set of good principles like the ones we're covering here tonight and the others in my book, and not from emotions. Reacting emotionally to your child's emotions is a very immature strategy, tit for tat, as we think of it. And instead, you need to manage them from a good set of principles, no matter how they're behaving. Once you've done all of this and you've adopted your shepherd's role as a parent, kick back, open a bottle of wine, enjoy the show. Learn to love what is so special, exceptional, and unique about the child you have. And you can't do that if you still long for the one you thought you'd get when you were pregnant. So the sooner you get past that hurdle, the sooner you realize you're in Holland and not Venice, the better off your family life is going to be because now you can start to enjoy Holland, the unique child that you got. Okay, principle number 3. What are the keys to succeeding with an ADHD child? When we look on the internet, when we look at follow-up studies like mine as well, and we look at people who succeeded in spite of their ADHD, not because of it, we don't have any evidence that ADHD is a major factor in making people gifted or talented or artists or musicians or athletes. Those traits may be there, but they're not due to being ADHD, right? But that doesn't mean your child doesn't have a whole slew of great aptitudes and other things that we can take advantage of. So when we look at Michael Phelps, Ty Pennington, and Adam Levine, and Simone Biles, and Bubba Watson, and many, many other celebrities and accomplished individuals like the owner of JetBlue and Richard Branson of Virgin Airlines and so on. These are highly successful people with ADHD, including people like Justin Timberlake, for instance. When we study them, what do we find? We find a combination of these factors. Number one, they had loved ones who were in their corner supporting them all the way. They had accepted this unusual, unique child that they got and the neurodevelopmental disorder that went with it. They also got professional help and a proper diagnosis, and then got their children treatment as needed. Michael Phelps was lucky because his mother was a vice principal and she was at the school with him, and she was able to work with his teachers and program his day into sort of 15-minute units of what Michael would be doing at each time and get him the extra help in and out of school he needed to get through school. But she also did something else, right? She took advantage of the extra help outside of school to not only promote his academic competence, but especially to promote the unique gifts that Michael had athletically as a swimmer. Many people don't realize that Michael comes from a very athletically talented family. Both of his sisters qualified for the Olympics as swimmers as well. And his father was an NFL football star for a while, I believe, played for the Washington Redskins. But nonetheless, after leaving football, he went on to become a policeman. But Michael comes from a family with a lot of good athleticism. And his mother, having recognized this early in Michael as well, sought to promote his other aptitudes. So the keys to success for an ADHD child are, besides having the loved ones we talked about, is identify your child's unusual aptitudes, abilities, strengths. They're often not traditional. They're usually not within school, such as reading, math, and spelling. It doesn't mean they can't be. Some children with ADHD are quite gifted in academics, but typically it's going to be in things that are not academic. It's going to be music, performing arts, stand-up comedy, maybe working with technology, maybe artistry, maybe photography, or culinary science, or outdoor recreation, or even entrepreneurs. We know that ADHD combines very well with entrepreneurial talents in order to help people be even more successful. So what does this child bring to the table that they seem to be unusually good at? The next thing that we do, and this is what Michael Phelps' mom did, is we promote its further development through practice, practice, practice. In addition, we identify community resources that can further promote the development of these unique talents. She went to the Baltimore Athletic Club and got one of the best swim coaches in the United States to work with Michael. And when he moved to the Midwest, Michael followed him out there as a young man to continue his training with that coach, even becoming an assistant to the coach to help him cover his own way out there. So find these area resources that can further promote these aptitudes, and then provide a safety net underneath them for their medical care, their psychological care, their academic support, their tutoring, in order to be in their corner all the time and trying to help them through the rough spots in their life. When you combine that with getting professional help for diagnosis and treatment, you are doing about as much as you're going to be able to do to ensure that you have a happy, successful child. So celebrate the non-traditional aspects of your child, and don't always expect that your child is going to be the one who's going to be academically talented, going to be the doctor or the lawyer, but instead could be someone who starts a new business as an entrepreneur like Richard Branson did, or somebody who succeeds in athletics or in performing arts like Adam Levine did, and so on. Look outside the box for those unique talents. Now, principle number 4, very important, and hardly anybody discusses this unless they've been to my workshops or read my books. ADHD causes time blindness. And I illustrate that through the 2 clocks you see here. The typical child, as they grow up, they develop a normal, typical sense of time, hence the typical clock. Look at the one on the right. That's your child. Who cares? You have a child who has no sense of time. And so like Dennis the Menace here, whom I thank for allowing me to show this cartoon, that is the cartoonist involved, Dennis is asking his father why he's even bothering setting the clock. Because to Dennis, it's always now. There's no yesterday, there's no tomorrow. It's just here, now, and we go through the now. That is ADHD in spades. Children with ADHD have a very delayed sense of time, and as a result, time management. They are blind to time, lost in the drift of this dimension that becomes more and more important with age. As you know, as we grow up, our life becomes very, very time sensitive and time dependent. We have appointments, we have calendars, we have bills to pay, we have work to get to, we have promises that we make to meet other people. Time, time, time. So if you're impaired in your sense of time and time management, look at how devastating that's going to be. You're going to be late for everything. You're never going to be ready. You're never going to have all the materials you need when you need it. The assignments are going to come and go, and you are going to be clueless as to getting these things done in time, on time, over time. So I want you to think of ADHD as time blindness. It's essentially a nearsightedness to the future. Children with ADHD don't look ahead. They live right now. And so to manage them, we have to be able to deal with this very impaired sense of time, this person who only lives in this moment. And the way you deal with children like that is you manage the moment. And I illustrate it very nicely by this cartoon that from closetehome.com that shows this preteen running into his mom's bedroom at, what is it, 2:30 in the morning on that clock? And look at what he's saying. Mom, mom, I just remembered I have to build a diorama of the Hoover Dam by second period tomorrow. It's a good thing Walmart's still open, huh? So what you're seeing here is a child who is blind to time and is leaving everything to utterly the 11th hour before they're able to cope with it. That so beautifully illustrates ADHD children. So how do we deal with time blindness? Well, I want you to think about time as coming at us in three pieces. There are the events that are moving toward us from the future into the moment. There's our responses that we prepare to get ready for that future to get here, getting our work done, fulfilling our agreements, and so on. And then there are the consequences that happen for whether or not we were ready when the event got here. I refer to this simply as ERO, event response outcome. Now, here's the deal. As long as the E's and R's and O's are together in time, you don't need a frontal lobe. All other species deal with the world that way. We call it behaviorism or Skinnerian learning, right? But when these events and responses are separated by time, you have to have a frontal lobe because that's what glues them back together into a single arrangement. And that's what disables your ADHD child. As time becomes involved in these events and responses, they become disabled. Classic example. Johnny, you have a book report. Here's the book I want you to read. The book report will be due in 1 week. Notice what we did. We dropped 7 days between the assignment and the eventual response. It's going to take the teacher 3 days to grade the papers. I now put 3 days between the response and the consequence. You got to have a frontal lobe, an executive brain to deal with that. And they don't, so they can't. So how do we help people with ADHD who can't bind these future events across time? By breaking them into baby steps, by minimizing the delays and doing small work quotas every day to build the steps in the bridge across time so that eventually we get across the chasm or the river of time to the other side. But we don't get there by pointing across the chasm and saying, there it is, it's coming, you need to get ready. That doesn't help these people at all. We have to break it down into mini pieces, do a piece a day, and when the future gets here, they're ready. And don't say, well, when are they going to learn this? They're not. They will mature, they will get better. When they're 10, they're better than they were at 6. When they're 18, they're better than they were at 10. But they're never quite up to where other people of the same age are at doing this. So they always need help with breaking things down into more manageable quotas so that we can get that work done, but do it in small bites, in chunks. So it's like you see here in the diagram. Don't point across the river of time. That just creates conflict and sadness and disappointment, as you see here. Do what the person on the left is doing and build the little baby steps, the blocks, the bricks of time across the river of time, and we'll get to the other side successfully and with a lot less hardship, conflict, and demoralization. Now, another thing we have to do is that the clock in the brain is broken. We can't rely on their sense of time. So don't give your child an assignment, let's say 30 minutes to get their homework done. They are clueless as to what 30 minutes is, how long that is, how much time has passed, how much do I have left. You have a natural clock in you, a natural sense of time. You have a pretty good idea of how long I've been speaking without looking at a clock. So your child doesn't have that. So to help them with these little assignments that have time intervals like 15, 20, 30 minutes, we need to make time real, make it physical. We need to get cooking timers, clocks, our cell phones, and set the digital timers on there. Any device you can think of that shows your child the passage of time as it's occurring so they can see how much they have left in order to get ready and to prepare. And if, of course, there's nothing for them to do but wait, such as standing in line at a grocery store or waiting for a movie or waiting to go somewhere that they're really excited about going, we need to fill that empty time with activity, with busyness, and not simply wait for them to be patient and pause and bridge that delay. Keep them busy, find something interesting to do, fill the time, and they'll be able to manage that time. Here's a clock you can get at Amazon. It's a 1-foot clock that has a red disc, and you can set it for up to an hour, and it slowly shows the passage of time. But the most important thing here isn't the little technique of using the clock. It's understanding why it's required. Your child's sense of time is very delayed. And nothing you can do is going to change that. So we have to work around it and solve that problem the best we can by making accommodations for it. Now, principle number 5 is also just as important. ADHD involves a massive problem with working memory. Working memory is a special memory that comes out of the front part of our brain. It's not long-term storage, it's not retrieval. It's instead actively holding in mind information about what we're doing. So on the slide, I refer to it as remembering so as to do. It's what I'm losing at my age. Once you get past 55, you don't lose memory. You lose working memory. What was I doing? Why was I going into that room? Where was I going on that car trip? We start to lose the ability to hold information in our mind and use it to guide ourselves to perform the task over time and get to our goal. So ADHD involves a serious problem with working memory. And what does that lead to? Very simply, it leads to this crucial problem I need you to understand. It goes like this. The back part of the brain is where you learn stuff. That's where we store knowledge. Wonderful. ADHD children have no trouble with that back part of the brain for the most part. They can learn things. They're as smart as anybody else, their age. The front part of the brain is where we activate that knowledge, bring it forward to that front part of the brain, hold it in mind, and guide our behavior over time. It's where we do what we know. So it's not about knowing what to do, it's about doing what we know. And ADHD separates those two functions of the brain. So it doesn't matter how much you know, how bright you are, how great a score you get on the SAT. You got to perform. You got to get the work done. And that's where it breaks down. So stop assuming that children with ADHD are stupid. They're not. They're not ignorant. They know largely what other people know, but they can't apply it in daily life at the crucial points in life where that information would have been very important to perform. ADHD is therefore a performance disorder. I want you to think of working memory like the GPS in your car, because quite frankly, they're almost identical, right? Look at the GPS in your car. What do we have? We have images, that's visual working memory. And we have words. It's talking to you about where to go. That's verbal working memory. We do the same thing. We hold images in our mind of what our goals are, how we hope to get there, and we talk to ourselves in our mind in order to get to the goals, just like we do with our GPS. So you can think of ADHD as a dysfunction in the brain's GPS, the working memory systems. They can't hold images and words in mind in order to guide their behavior over time to get to their destinations. And as a result, they have a lot of trouble doing what we ask them to do, remembering to do. They remember things, they don't remember what they're supposed to be doing right now. How then can we deal with that? Offload working memory. Put the important information that you want to guide them, the rules, the clues, put it in front of them on sticky notes, reminders, little 3x5 file cards with lists of the rules for homework time, and so on. Get the information out of the mind. You have to do for an ADHD child what I at 71 have to do all day long. You wouldn't believe the notes that are on my desk right now, and why I write notes in the morning when I get up. I've become incredibly note dependent. Why? Because my working memory is aging and decaying. And if I don't do these things, I won't be able to get those things done because I can't hold in mind what my goals and tasks are, what the sequence is. So think of ADHD as kind of like being an old man times 10, except that you're 6 or 7 or 10, you're not 71 like I am. But it's still the same problem. Working memory isn't working. So offload it, get it onto some other storage device, a piece of paper, a card, a cue, a note, a reminder, and put it in front of them where the work is to be done to help remind them of what they're supposed to do. We call this making accommodations at the point of performance, but it's basically going over the rules before the task is started and making sure those rules are in their visual field. I like to think of this as the scaffolding we put around them to help them. So let me review. Offload the content of working memory onto something else that they can see while they're working. Notes, cards, cues. You can use digital recording devices as well if you need to. You can try using high tech like Outlook and your computerized calendars and other things. We haven't found that they work so well. Low tech is best. So notes, cues, journals, week at a glance calendars. Paper is better than tech at guiding ADHD people's behavior. You can use pictures. You can use images you get off the internet and print them out and put them around them, like images of what are the steps to getting dressed? What are the steps to brushing our teeth? What are the steps to getting ready for bed? And we can have picture sequences in front of younger ADHD children that help to guide them and keep them on task. How you do this is up to you. What I want you to understand is that working memory isn't working. And we have to make the information in mind physical and then go over it with them periodically during the task so that they keep it actively in mind. So let's get to my last principle, which I think is among the most important here. You can see the other 6 principles in my book if you like, but to me, I'm going to wrap up on a very important one. You're a shepherd to a disabled child. You better get good at practicing forgiveness. Forgiveness to me comes in 3 forms. First, you are going to make mistakes in managing your child. We all do. All parents make mistakes in raising typical children. You're going to make even more mistakes because you have a special child with disruptive behavior, poor self regulation, and special needs. You're going to make these mistakes. That's okay. Forgive yourself. What's important is not that you're perfect, right? It's that you learn to cope. You try to get it right the next time. So if you make a mistake, you apologize. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say that. Let's try to do it this way. So the best parents for ADHD children are parents who cope with their imperfections and practice forgiveness of themselves. Number 2, you better get good at forgiving other people outside your home. They don't get it. They don't understand ADHD. They think it's your fault. You just didn't know how to raise this child. Some of them are even going to tell you that, right? So you better get a thick skin. You better get good at forgiving other people their ignorance about ADHD, because otherwise you're going to be concerned about going out in public, taking your child shopping, concerned about what teachers are going to tell you because you think that they're blaming you. And you know what? Sometimes they probably are. But so what? You know it's not your fault. You know this is biological. You know this is the unique child you were given to raise. So you better get good at cognitive therapy, if you want to think of it that way, at forgiving other people their mistakes. And then most importantly, you're going to have to be really good at forgiving your child their mistakes, because ADHD children make a lot more mistakes than other children. They don't have the self control of other children. They need a lot more caretaking, a lot more management. You have to become their frontal lobe, their executive brain for a while. So expect a lot of mistakes. Now, if you don't handle those properly, the resentment is going to build up over time. Sometimes that resentment gets to such a point that you think your child is intentionally doing these things to make you angry, upset, annoyed. I know it feels that way, but they're not, right? And by the way, that's a very dangerous mindset, because if you think your child is doing this, you can get very spiteful and vindictive, even abusive to your child. You need to understand that your child is disabled. We don't get angry at disabled children for having their disability. So you need to get good at forgiving your child the frequent mistakes they're going to make. Now, there are various ways that you're going to have to find ways to discover, how do I do that? But I'll give you just a couple examples from families I work with. One mom found she was able to do it this way. One day her child came in and he'd gone outside and he'd picked some flowers for her at springtime, like it is now here in Richmond. And he came in and handed her a bouquet of flowers. Here, mom, these are for you. And she had the presence of mind to take her cell phone, take a picture of them, and then later she printed that out and put it on her refrigerator. And she looks at it several times a day. That's her child. So that when he gets upset, when he's frustrated, when he's disrupted, she can look at that picture and say, that's my real child. This is just a passing phase. I'm only temporarily here. That's the real child that I have. So try that. Here's another one. A dad taught me this one. At the end of the day, he took a legal sheet of paper after he put his child to bed and he wrote down everything that went wrong that day in Sharpie with exclamation marks. And he just vented, kind of like an exorcism. And then after he was done, he stepped outside, took a match and lit the paper and burned it and let it fall into the grass. Gone. That's it. It's over. Okay. Day's done. There go the mistakes. I forgive you. And let's get back to a loving relationship with this child. One mom even said for her younger ADHD child, what helped her was, if it was a really bad day, she waited till the child fell asleep. She tiptoed up the steps and sat in the dark room with the door slightly open so the light could hit her child's face, and she watched him sleep. There is nothing more innocent than watching a young child sleeping. If that doesn't melt your heart, if that doesn't help you get rid of the vindictiveness, the resentment over the mistakes, well, you are quite the little psychopath, let me tell you, because I don't know anybody who isn't deeply touched by that image. And if you need to take a glass of wine up with you, so be it. But find your own way forward to forgive your child the mistakes of the day. So if you will understand and manage your child's ADHD following these 6 principles and even the other 6 that are in my book, if you'll understand ADHD for the developmental disability that it is, and then try as best you can to follow through on these principles, you will raise a happier, more effective, more successful child who is well adapted to the environment and well adjusted. And most importantly, there'll be more peace in your family, and your child will not be as demoralized. They will have a better sense of themselves and who they are, and that they're loved within your family. And more important than anything else, including school, is that relationship with that child. That is your foundation and theirs for the rest of your life. Take it seriously. It's important that you continue to build on that relationship. So thank you to Varsity Tutors for inviting me to speak to you this evening. Brian, thank you so much for having me on. And I think we've been able to allow a few minutes here for Q&A. So let me just get out of my program and get back to yours. Thank you.
Hey, thank you so much, Dr. Barkley. This was, I say, if you can, if you can laugh, cry and think in a session. It's been a
Yeah.
session, or even in a day. It's been a day well lived. And I think for so
Yeah.
many of us, we got a chance to do all of those things today. Just
Yeah.
amazing advice.
Thank you.
You mentioned ADHD as a continuum,
Yeah.
and kind of wherever you personally fall on that continuum, or your children fall on that continuum. I think there was amazing advice for just life in general in there. So
Thank you.
thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Yes. So true.
And I'm reflecting back. I've been watching the comments come through. We've got quite a few of those. I'll handle a couple quick ones. People saying thank you for being so honest, truthful, frank.
Yeah.
Thank you for ending with some optimism. I think a lot of people
Yeah.
have things to think about and all that. A lot of other people asking about the name of the book. Remember, if you do upload something or post something to Twitter and tag Varsity Tutors tonight with something you learned from tonight's session, you'll be entered to win a signed copy of that book. It's 12 Principles for Raising a Child with ADHD is the official title. We'll also have those official rules up with a link to Dr. Barkley's website where you can learn more, find other resources and all those kinds of things. So people want to know that. People also want to know if they can check out the slides later. This will be up on our YouTube channel right after class, at least for a period of time. So if you missed anything, didn't get a chance to take notes, want to share it with a friend, go and do that. All right. Questions have been amazing. One that I think, it came up quite a bit. I'm going to check my notes here real quick. If you forgive me looking down. There's a lot of things parents should be doing to kind of help scaffold, you mentioned, structure, children's lives. A lot of people had, a variation of the question, how do I balance, giving my child the fish versus teaching them to fish? What can I do to get them doing some of these habits, time management and keeping tasks in front of them, doing those things for themselves?
Okay, it's a great question, and it leads me to want to emphasize just two very simple parts here. First of all, understand they're not going to be like other children. So even though we work on time management and we put structure around them and we help them with reminders and calendars and pings on our phone with whatever the schedule happens to be, the fact is you're going to be doing that more often and longer across development than another family of a typical child has to do. So part one is stop thinking that you can get rid of the time management problem, because you can't rehearse this to the point where it's gone. That's like asking a family in a wheelchair whose child comes into their home using a ramp every day, Dr. Barkley, how long do we have to leave the ramp out there before she's internalized the ramp and we don't need it there anymore? Well, do you see how kind of ridiculous that is, right? So the ramp is there to allow her to succeed. It's not there to train her out of the damn wheelchair. And so make sure that you understand that while we are going to improve their time management, we can use a lot of supports and prompts and structure and breaking tasks down. And then just over and over. By the way, the more you rehearse, the more you do, the more you don't need your frontal lobe anymore. It gets back into the automatic brain. So a lot of over rehearsal and practice will help, but it's never being done with the idea that I'm only going to do this for 3 weeks or 6 weeks, and then they're going to get it, and then I don't have to worry about it anymore. This isn't a lifestyle choice whereby you doing these things, they go, aha, and wake up and smell the coffee and are no longer ADHD and time blind. That ain't happening, right? So just understand, they don't lack for a sense of time. It's just very immature. So when they're 10, they're like a 7-year-old. When they're 16, they're like a 12-year-old. They're better. They're 5 years better than where they were before, but they're not where 16-year-olds should be. And the same is true when they're 18 and so on. By the way, what does that say about getting a driver's license if you have ADHD? Whoa. What were you thinking? Do you see what I'm talking about? Once you understand the executive age, you realize that a lot of these hurdles in life, whether it's time management, whether it's homework, whether it's driving, we got to take that slower. We got to have more scaffolding, more structure to get through that without them being harmed by this. My twin brother with ADHD died in a car accident because of his ADHD. So you got to take that seriously. So on the one hand, we can improve their time management, their self-awareness, and other things by the scaffolding, by the rehearsal. And as they mature, it will get better on its own. Their brain is growing. It is getting there. It will be able to do these things eventually, but not right now. So they will improve. You can back off. You can thin out what you want to do, but don't ever think that you're not going to be doing extra things for this child relative to other kids their age. Because if that's what you're thinking, you're like the mom that says we don't have to put the ramp in front of the house anymore because the daughter in the wheelchair internalized the ramp. Ha ha ha. That's not going to happen. So let's understand we can improve it and we will improve it. And they will improve as they mature. But it takes time, it takes patience, it takes our rehearsal and our willingness to put that scaffolding there and keep it there as long as we need to. And then eventually they grow and they do learn, but never expect that they are going to be exactly like typical kids their age. Because now you're thinking, "Ah, I can engineer my child," and you've given up the shepherd's model to become the architect. And you're not an architect, you're not an engineer. So I hope that it shows that there's hope and there's things that we can do. There's a lot that we can do to help ADHD children. Just take a look at my books and all the information on the internet. But underneath that, as there is with autism, as there is with Down syndrome and other neurodevelopmental disabilities, there is acceptance of my disabled child, the compassion, the forgiveness, the willingness, not this pound on you until you become typical. Because if that's what you think you're going to do, you're the problem, not the child. So, adopt the shepherd's model. And I think that and the scaffolding and the rehearsal, and you'll be doing about as good as you can do. And then sit back and would you just love the one you got? That's the hardest part sometimes. Stop trying to make them into something they're not.
Thank you. Yeah, I had written down too the welcome to Holland. I think is just a great kind of metaphor for life.
Right.
That
Right.
you are where you are, and
It
and
ain't
what
Venice.
you
That's right.
control is how you react to it. But the
Yeah. Yeah.
situation was given to you. So
So true.
so
So
thank you.
true. Yeah.
Hey, you mentioned it's going to be a strange segue, but you mentioned the one technique of watching a child sleep and
Right.
seeing the innocence there. And actually, that brought up what I thought was a great question: is does ADHD relate to sleep issues? Is that maybe a time
Oh, yeah.
management kind of a thing?
Yeah.
And what
Yeah.
are some
Yeah.
strategies for dealing specifically with that?
Sure. Sure. No question. Up to 40% or more of ADHD children and adults have disrupted sleep. They have sleeping issues. There are various kinds. They're not all the same. Some people, it's insomnia. They have a delayed, what we call diurnal rhythm. They're more attentive in the afternoon and evening, especially the adults, and they have insomnia, so they tend to stay up later. So we have that we have to deal with. The second thing, of course, is that if they're on ADHD medications, particularly stimulants, it can make that insomnia worse. So you need to make sure it's not the medication that's causing the sleep onset problem. If it is, you can back up the medication schedule, maybe start earlier in the day so it washes out earlier. In addition to that, you can also go to the latest new stimulant medication, which is Jornay, which you take at 9 o'clock at night, and it automatically activates the next morning so that your child's getting their dose very early, earlier than you could give it. As they're waking up, the medication's activating. It also covers that early morning, very stressful period of time getting out the door for school and work when other medications might be delayed. And then, of course, if there's a problem later in the evening, you can also add some over the counter things like melatonin sublingual under the tongue. Talk to your doctor about that to be sure, but that can accelerate sleep onset by 20 to 30 minutes. The second thing I need you to do is to understand that ADHD families often have more chaotic bedtime routines. So make sure that your bedtime routine is hygienic, as we say, meaning that it's very predictable, it's the same every weeknight, and that you do a step down gradually to reduce the stimulation. You don't take a child off a video game, slam him in a dark bedroom, turn off the light, kiss him, and walk out. You can't do that to an ADHD child, right? You've cranked up their brain with their screen time, and now you put them in a dark bedroom with no stimulation at all. Well, there will be hell to pay, let me tell you, if you do that. So what you need to do is to get off the screen an hour to an hour and a half before bedtime. Move to quieter activities, board games. Maybe we read together. Then we do bath and shower. Then we sit and talk about our day in bed together. Maybe we'll even read a little bit of a story. Then when I leave the room, I have a night light on, I have a white noise machine, or I leave a radio playing music very softly in the background as I exit the room. Step it down. and do it predictably, and you should find some of the bedtime problems are dealt with. Now, about 20% of ADHD children may have disrupted or interrupted sleep where they're waking up frequently, they may snore, it sounds like they have obstructed airway, heavy breathing. If that's the case and they're showing a lot of fatigue the next day, talk to your pediatrician about whether or not your child is developing sleep apnea or has an obstructed airway, because about 1 in 5 to 1 in 10 ADHD children may have that problem. And we now have at least 6 studies showing that tonsillectomies benefit ADHD children by opening up the airway, allowing them to sleep better. Their attention and ADHD symptoms are much better in school the next day. So while the vast majority of ADHD children may not have this problem and surely do not need surgery, there will be that rare child with sleep apnea or obstructed breathing where your physician can talk to you about maybe we need a sleep study, and then maybe removal of the tonsils and adenoids would be the way to go. So that's how I would recommend approaching that. What is the nature of the problem? And there's various things that you can do to deal with that. Thanks, Brian.
Nice. Oh, thank you. Thanks for such a thorough answer. One
Yeah.
trend was as people were asking questions, you would
Yeah.
pre-answer some of those. If I can get you for 2 more, because there've been some amazing questions. One is you mentioned screen time in relation to bedtime and trying to wind that down a little bit more. A lot of people had questions about screen time and recommendations for that more in general. And then one word that came up a lot in the questions and not as much, and maybe some of us might have expected to hear a little bit more, is distractions. Like how should we think about keeping distractions away from students? You did mention that sometimes pencil and paper is better than technological tools. Can you talk a little bit about screen time, technology, and other distractions that we should be aware of?
Well, that's a very broad topic. It would depend on what's the device and what's the app and what's the game and are they using the internet? And, like for instance, my grandchildren, I mean, is this the tablet or laptop that's been issued by the school? If so, it's got protections on it and parents can go in and, put up parental controls and block access to various websites. So you may need to do that. You can also build in timers that shut off internet access for X period of time each day. There are a lot of workarounds for keeping your child from being distracted when they're on technology and needing to use it for school or homework, where they can't get access to these other things, or where you limit the access that they have to a certain period of time, and then the whole thing shuts down. Now, gaming is okay. Just make sure it's not violent or aggressive games. We do have evidence to show that while aggressive video games don't harm typical children, don't increase their aggression, they do increase the aggressiveness of impulsive, easily gullible, and often aggressive children. ADHD children are prone to reactive aggression. So more than other parents, you really got to watch the kind of content of the games you're letting your child have access to. And then thirdly is use it as a reward for getting the other non-technical things done. So there may be schoolwork that has to be done. There may be chores that have to be done at home that the child needs to get done. When those are done, you get access to the screen time. Screen time is not a birthright, although many children these days think that it is, right? It's a privilege. It's something we pay for, right? And you have a right to control that and to use it as the carrot in order to get the work accomplished. So, I'm not saying no screen time. We know that ADHD isn't caused by screen time, but we know that too much screen time can distract from the other work that needs to get done. We also know that ADHD children are prone to go to screen time because it's more reinforcing to them than others. So we got to watch that because 16% of ADHD kids have an internet addiction to gaming by the time they're teenagers. And that's a big problem. And it only got worse during the pandemic, by the way. We have evidence to show that as well. So use screen time wisely, use it for its educational activities, even for fun and for gaming, but limit that time and then it shuts down. And then we go on and we do other things.
Thank you. It's a good advice. I think for really anyone along that continuum, but particularly for those with the diagnosis. Last question for you, and thank you for being so generous with your time and insight and all those kind of things. Reminder: people were asking about the book title, and it's 12 Principles for Raising a Child with ADHD. We went through 6 of them here, so just a sneak preview of what else can we find in the book that if you upload your something you learned tonight to Twitter, you have a chance to win a signed copy of, but is also available. We'll have links to be able to avail that if you'd like. But it's a quick sneak preview. What can we expect from the other 6?
Surely. Okay. So you had one more, you said?
Oh, that was the question. I was going to say,
Oh,
what is something we can expect
okay.
to learn, hear more about if we
Yeah,
grab the
yeah.
other
Well,
six in the book?
I think at this point, I would be expecting to hear more. But first of all, about the biology of ADHD, certainly the fastest moving area of research right now is genetics and connecting genetics up to neurology. We're not to the point where we can do genetic testing. Please don't pay for that stuff. If they tell you they can diagnose ADHD by genes, they can't do that. But we're getting there. So hopefully, biology is going to help us out. Certainly, we're learning more about technology. There's many companies working on training apps and other things to try to see if they can find ways to improve ADHD symptoms. We haven't found it yet. Nothing on the market right now succeeds at helping people with ADHD at the moment, but companies are going back to the drawing board and really working with technology to see if we can come up with what I call these prostheses, these artificial limbs, if you will, of ways of working around the deficits in ADHD. And then I think for me anyway, we come back to the last message that I have. A large part of having an ADHD child and surviving a child with ADHD is parental attitude. What is your frame of mind? What is your frame of reference toward this individual? The more you are in tune with their disorder and more compassionate with their deficits and more understanding of their uniqueness, their neurodiversity, as we say in contemporary language, the better the match is going to be between you and this child, and the stronger your relationship will be. And to me, that is the most important thing, not the schoolwork, not the chores, but that relationship. So treasure that, value that, build on that. And Brian, thank you again, and my thanks to Varsity Tutors for this invitation to speak this evening.
Oh, thank you for all the amazing insight. Again, for leaving on a high note of of positive attitude and just loving kids
Yeah,
for who they are. So
yes.
thank you so much to you, Dr. Barkley. Thanks to everyone out there
Yes,
for all of
thank
your great
you.
questions. I know
Thanks.
we had a lot. We didn't quite get to all of them, but they do all matter. So we'll put up some links here for more resources, also for those contest rules. So we hope to see you spread some of the things you learned tonight across social media, and I hear the instructions to do that. That's the title of the book if you want to learn a little bit more, and also the Varsity Tutors website if you're interested in some of our resources for students with learning differences. Also, Dr. Barkley's website for more information there. So huge thanks to everyone, especially to Dr. Barkley, and we hope to see all of you back here again soon. So thanks, everybody.